All right. One of the most profound quotations I've ever read was spoken by the late Dr. Maya Angelou. And she said, when people show you who they are, believe them. Tonight, we're going to have a conversation. Today, we're going to have a conversation on racism healing, and it's a community conversation. I'm joined by four fabulous individuals that will discuss our topic tonight, today, and offer some feedback. But before we get started, I want to say that undoubtedly one of the more difficult pieces of advice I have tried to follow in Dr. Angelou's quotation, but in so many instances, these words ring true. And we should take people at their word, because when someone really shows you and tells you who they are, we must truly believe them. This summer, my colleagues and I spent countless hours studying, reading, and discussing ways we become informed diversity advocates and support the learning process of a future generation of scholars. We read Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. We also spent some time working with Amplify RJ facilitators, which was extremely helpful and eye-opening. However, just after the Breonna Taylor decision was released, I thought, why is it so difficult to discuss racism? So I turned to my colleagues, who I consider, again, experts in the field, to discuss the important topic with the hopes of expanding our views on race conversations, on race and conversations about race. Please welcome Ms. Yasmin Cader. She is a lawyer and founder of Cader Adams Trial Lawyers. Ms. Kimberly West-Faulcon, professor of law and James P. Bradley Chair in Constitutional Law at Loyola Law School and a Marlborough School parent. Ms. Jenn Wells, Marlborough's inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And Ms. Taryn Marshall, history instructor at Marlborough, also in her first year. Welcome. So I'll start with my first question for everyone. Race is one of the most sensitive topics out there. How do you talk about racism, and how do you feel when you hear, read, and watch stories of racial incidences?
I feel like talking about racism is it's just one of those topics that I'm always aware of, and I kind of carry with me and into every space that I walk into, especially at work, with colleagues, with friends. And I don't know if there's a certain way that I do talk about racism, but I do know that I'm aware and constantly tiptoeing that line of like, do I bring this up or do I not? And that I'm trying to be more unapologetic in that, but it's still like this process that I'm going through. It's easier to talk about racism with my students, I think, than with other adults. And, you know, we can touch on that a little bit more later, but, and then to the question of like, how do I feel? I feel a weight, and I feel like, okay, life is still happening, yet I still have to show up in this space or these spaces on a regular basis. And how do I, yeah, I guess how do I reconcile with that? And you know, that's just the first thing that comes to mind, but I just wanted to start there.
I'll take the bait. I think I talk about racism very easily and race very easily. I think the reason for that is a combination of I was born and raised in the American South by African-American parents who did not, well, they lived under Jim Crow state-sanctioned segregation and spoke very easily of that. I mean, and my daughter actually recognizes that there is a degree to which even people, when I describe that, there's a stereotyped set of connotations and images that come with that. That you're describing people who are 100% of the time, all of their lives, oppressed. Absolutely not. It was just a part of life, a part of a successful and amazing life, and in a life, if you look at it intersectionally, had vast amounts of privilege within that. I'm also, these are people whose both their parents own their own businesses, farms, but my father talked and speaks still very easily of, well, there was the Indian bus, there was the white bus, and then there was the bus I caught. So if you grow up around people who speak of race easily, you come to speak of race easily. But there is an extent to which I think I also speak of race easily, because my first job out of when Yasmin and I met at Yale Law School, and I went on to work for about a decade. And I hope, Yasmin, you'll share what your first job as a lawyer was as well, because I think that influences how we engage with even this question. I was a civil rights lawyer. And I didn't go to law school intending to have a racial lens to that. I went to law school intending to do education civil rights. And then because of how little our constitutional system does to protect students' right to a quality education, to the extent that I wanted to have any cause of action or anything I could sue about, that led me to race as an entry point to broader justice. But that made me a race woman. I mean, like that's what people who worked at the Legal Defense Fund before me, they were race men and race women. Now with that came a lot of negativity during the time that Yasmin and I were in law school. We were in law school where to be this person who spoke of race was to be the racist person. Mm-hmm. We came through law school when it was all sorts of talk of we're heading to a colorblind world, and anybody who wants to think about race is themselves a racist. So I was a civil rights lawyer for a decade where Ward Connerly and the likes of other people who were trying to dismantle race-conscious interventions to make this world anti-racist called me a bigot on a regular basis. So that hardens you to whatever in polite company someone who finds it uncomfortable to talk about race might think of it. Because I have, at least certainly at the age I am now, feel it's very important to be a 24-hour authentic self when it comes to race. And certainly age helps, right? And so God help anyone if I live long enough, when you meet me a couple of decades from now, what I will or won't be able to say about race. But it's never pejorative. It's never pejorative. It is always descriptive, and with an absolute recognition that I don't have it all worked out intersectionally. Can I be offensive? Can I be misogynistic? Yes, I'm a woman. Can I be racist? Yes, I'm an African American. Can I make mistakes when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? 1,000% possible. But not being willing to talk about it and suffer in silence can't happen. And because of how much privilege I've enjoyed, I've always felt that obligation to be the one. If I'm in the room, then I've got to speak about it and call it out if necessary and take the flack that comes with that. So easy, way too easy probably for those who have to put up with me for me to talk about race.
Yeah, I can connect in a lot of what Taryn and Kimberly have said connects for me. I grew up Black and Filipino, so that's my actual racial background. And so when I think about what did it mean to talk about race growing up, I feel like a lot of times it was this in-between, living in this in-between of different races and feeling a deep racial experience that other folks could easily be like, oh no, that has nothing to do with being Black, or, oh yeah, everyone knows you're Filipino. And so as my career evolved and I connected with Kimberly saying like the having a job where you're the race person, right? I'm now at Marlborough as the Director of Equity and Inclusion, and I've taken many jobs where I've been kind of centering what does it look like to fight for racial justice on college campuses or in education, and had to become comfortable, I guess, with kind of being the one to raise uncomfortable conversations, right? Being the one to kind of be like, hey, you know, there might be something that's not quite right about that policy that you're proposing, or actually our Black students are being held to an incredibly difficult standard that's actually not aligned with how you're holding other students accountable, or being able to name kind of when race was showing up. I think over the years, I have learned that what's important for me, and I think that like thinking about how healing intersects with these ideas of talking about racism, for me, I've learned to assess how much energy I have that day. What is my role in that conversation, right? So the energy might be low, but the role might be I'm an educator. And so at that time in that day, I might engage in a conversation. But on other days where the energy is low and maybe my role is a participant, I don't know that that's always been the most prudent for me at that time to raise that. But I think what also comes with that is knowing being in community with others where maybe I'm not the only one who would be raising those issues, right? And knowing that either there's allies in the room or accomplices, as our students will say, or knowing that there are other folks that I can count on who've also are committed to that racial justice to also raise those when I don't have the capacity in that time or space. When I think about like, how do I feel when these racist incidences occur, it's interesting because I think it's a cycle of going through like, why did this happen? Oh, of course this happened. How do I not internalize what happened? The anger, what do I do with this anger, this sadness that occurs for me? And how do I find community usually after that, right? And finding a community not only to think about like my healing process, but also what does the next step of liberation look like? Is there an educational conversation that needs to occur? Is it we all need to get together to find a moment of activism or organizing? Just something that lets that outlet happen after feeling so disempowered after some of these events.
Any comments, Yasmin?
Well, I'm just really appreciating these different perspectives. And I think that part of what it highlights for me is just how we are not a monolith. Mm-hmm. You know, you have 4 Black women here who are coming at this issue from very different perspectives, different backgrounds. But there are certain commonalities that I'm hearing and that I agree with. And there, I guess there are 3 buckets I would put them in. One is the challenge of talking about racism in the dual challenge of processing it personally and then also having those conversations with people whose perspectives are different or whose history and experiences are different, and where do you come together on that? So that challenge is one. I think the second challenge is one that I think is really important, which is, you know, I'm a graduate of Yale Law School with Kimberly, but before that I was a graduate of Howard University. Mm-hmm. And having that experience and being in that context and analyzing these issues through that lens it's a very different type of analysis, in the sense of it wasn't, when we talked about issues of American history, okay, that's what, you know, American history is you can't talk about American history and not talk about, or you can't talk about colonialism, you know, you can't talk about lots of things without talking about racism. But it wasn't, you know, okay, now we're going to focus on this for one, you know, semester or one section of the broader course. It was the analysis that we approached mainstream issues through, was the lens of Blackness. And so that was a very different way to talk about race, and having that experience, I think, enabled me to not always feel that it was so very painful. I mean, it was historical, but it was also very much a conversation about fortitude and success and survival and thriving in those contexts. So I think when it depends on the context you're in and when you're talking about how you feel. But then the third bucket, and what I'm hearing everyone say is back to that question of how does it feel and how do you do it and how do you process it? I mean, I do think there's a grieving process that you very well articulated, Jenn, and that there's also a compartmentalization process that you talked about, Kimberly, particularly for those of us who, for whom it intersects directly with our work, which is basically everybody here on the call. So I think some of that compartmentalization is necessary. As Kim noted, she was a race woman, civil rights lawyer, and I also started my career after clerking as a civil rights lawyer in the employment context in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And so that was my job, was to look at racial disparity in hiring. I then became a public defender for 23 years in 3 different major cities. And in many ways, that was the front line of the civil rights movement, because it was really where, in my opinion, African Americans were facing extraordinary institutional discrimination and oppression. So that's a necessary, I guess, third component of the discussion is how we have to necessarily compartmentalize and do so effectively.
Thank you for that. I want to take off of something that Kimberly said. She talked about being, for 24 hours, being your authentic self. And thinking about that more, and with Marlborough starting girls at in the 7th grade, and Jenn, I'm thinking about you, and Kimberly, I'm thinking about you. How do we, and at what point is it a good idea to have the conversations about race? When do you talk to your kids about race? When do we talk to our students? I mean, as an English teacher, it comes up in literature. And Jenn, we've had that conversation about that with my colleagues in the English department, but it comes up in literature, and it comes up in literature even before the 7th grade, but particularly in some of the texts that we're teaching in 7th grade. At what point in time do we stop and we have those conversations about racial relations?
I'll jump in as someone who has a 20-year-old. So, and also someone who's already tried to locate myself in this conversation as possibly on the outer edges of whatever bell curve there might be. Mm-hmm. But as far as when I personally started talking to my children about race, as soon as they could talk, because as soon as they can talk, you're starting to teach them color. And then as soon as they start to interact with other people, well, first of all, as soon as probably before that, I went out of my way in a time where it wasn't nearly as easy as it is now, to make sure they had Black children in their board books. Got to get in the car, drive to this now no longer there beautiful Inglewood Children's Bookstore to find a picture and books that would look like my children. And when I'm pregnant with the daughter who's at Marlborough, a book so her brother can see a pregnant mom with the pregnant belly, that's Black people, so we can explain, hey, what's going to happen. So that teaching about who you are versus, if I had just gone to the local Barnes and Noble, started there. But as soon as you're in preschool, you're learning the color Black. I want to be, and my mother taught me by example and explicitly, if you want your kids to understand something about race but race in particular, you must teach them first. You don't wait for someone else to teach them about it for you. And that was great, brilliant insight on her part. So I always was trying to get this, some people try and get ahead, and it doesn't hurt, right? Get ahead on whatever the math lesson is going to be for next year, but do that before my kid is sitting in the room and someone says, hey, there's Black like the crayon, he, or I'm brown, and then your African-American kid ends up confused. So it has been for me something that is part of breathing, teaching them about race And then racism, I guess that's a little more difficult. I did try to protect my children from equating being African American with being oppressed. I actually tried to overcompensate and founded an African American children's book club and brought together a bunch of other little Black kids. We read lots of Black books, and to the point that my son, it's a wonderful story I remember very vividly. One of his dearest friends, a white kid in his private school, he said, "So-and-so is African American, right, Mommy?" Because African American is the best. And this kid is so far from African American that, you know, my husband and I just laughed and laughed. But that's something that I feel that it's very difficult in this country, because if people get to your kid too quickly, the first thing they hear is Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and the back of the bus, and and I remember growing up with Blackness equated with shame and enslavement and all of this negativity, not because I didn't have great Black role models and the parents I just described, but because the way it came up, and I didn't have the great privilege of going to any historically Black institutions like Howard University. So I never had that experience. So for me, it's always, you better get it at home. You better get to your kids early. So I wanted to jump in because I was like, well, you can't do it any quicker than that, right? Before they're born, you're reading Black books to them. So I think race very early. Racism, I say maybe 6 or 7. I didn't give them long, but 6 or 7 before the history of the country came in, but always very careful to distinguish and to engage with what Yasmin is describing. To me, Blackness is an amazing gift. To me, Blackness is you have the blood of people. Your ancestors have endured something that is unimaginable. And how strong must you be? How we've been in this nation before this country was a country. So centuries of ancestors that have persevered and had to endure, and it's unimaginable, but spoken in my house for you to even be here. You know, I'm hardcore. I'm like, well, if it'd been me, I'd probably just jumped off the slave ship. I would have just committed suicide and you wouldn't exist. So it is very difficult, I'm sure, for people to imagine what I have forced my kids to keep in their head all at the same time at a very young age. But I also sent my daughter to a Montessori school. There is a philosophy that you expose kids to the same kind of information and you just give it age appropriately, whether that's sex education or race education. And so I never made it age appropriate, but I think there is an age appropriate lesson probably at any stage, at any age where you find your kid.
It's interesting because Kim shared with me many of these books, which she came before me, but where my children, one is still in elementary school, they talk about the system of slavery in kindergarten. So that that's coming. But I agree very much about, I just want to make sure that we're, it isn't a bad thing. I don't like talking about race, whatever that is, because that's a false construct anyway, right? But, affirming and celebrating culture, your own, and being rooted in your own and celebrating your own culture, affirming and celebrating other people's culture, right? And learning about other people's cultures, and then learning about, ways that things are cultures enhance and celebrate each other, or sometimes people denigrate each other. I think I like to think about it in that really broad way. That said, in this country, there is, and I'm grateful for the conversation now, there's a specific type of racism, of anti-Black racism, that needs to be analyzed separately and different from other types of racism. And one of my dearest friends from law school is Japanese American. She's from here. And she taught me so much and opened my eyes so much to that unique form of intersectional racism that she endured, which is different, but then also she has cultural, extraordinary, rich cultural history to share with me, to celebrate as well. So I guess I like to think about it in all of in as much of a celebration of one's own culture as it is, you know, dealing with the things that can happen that are problematic. But that requires, with certain cultures, a real intentional parenting of instilling pride. And that's not hard, not if you're, you know, and it doesn't mean to the exclusion of somebody else, you know, it doesn't have to be hierarchical in any way, but just because the world, through subliminal as well as explicit ways of we're seeing, especially right now, is there to cut down your babies, you know, to cut down your children, that you have to take a very affirmative, I think, stance to celebrate all that is fabulous about being who you are. And it doesn't in any way have to be to the exclusion or in a hierarchical way over somebody else, but it just is a certain level of intentionality that I approach it from. So I think talking about culture and talking about race, you know, is very separate from talking about racism, you know, in a way, because as Kim said, I don't want to be defined as, you know, looking through the lens of struggle, you know. I look at my culture through the lens of celebration.
I love that.
And I think kids also, and adults as well, there's so much disinformation about what race is. I mean, if we're going to have a conversation about race, I'm glad Yasmin points out, it's a social construct.
Mm-hmm.
And even very explicitly explaining to very young children that race is not a scientific reality in any way, shape, or form, despite the fact that every generation has its set of pseudoscientists that want to teach adults that it is. That's something that if you learn it early, it really helps as you move along and you meet people who have very diverse cultural backgrounds. I mean, there are other things I've taught my kids. Like, you don't ever ask someone what their race is, the same way you teach them to use a knife and a fork. There are just some things that are impolite, right? I just think there's a lot of just very basic how-tos, and that if people learn them earlier, that what Yasmin is describing, we could avoid making it about hierarchy. And also, when you run into people who just don't understand, you have the tools to have a conversation, because my kids are also very acutely aware that not everyone has been exposed to the amount of education about these topics that they have. And that's not a reason to denigrate anyone. It's a chance, if you're interested, like Jenn is saying, and you're up for educating, but it is mostly to teach them to be good people, right? Like good, happy people. And yes, and when my son said, you know, African Americans are the best, you know, that wasn't because there was a hierarchy, right? It was maybe there was a little overcorrection, right? But he had gotten the message. But I'm glad you're catching me, Yasmin, because it certainly has never been. We don't want to replace the racial hierarchy of white supremacy with a different hierarchy. Never been what I think I'm trying to imbue in my children. But yeah, it's something that it doesn't happen enough, I think, in our broader society to have that clarification that Yasmin is pointing out. You know, what is race? I think there's a lot of adults who really don't understand that fully.
I appreciate what's being brought up, and it reminds me of thinking about maybe those parents who might be listening to this conversation and not necessarily raising Black children, and this idea of like, when do you talk about race, right? And I've seen on the internet recently, like, if my Black children can experience racism at their young age by being discriminated in the classroom or just living their life, your white child can maybe grapple with race, and you could teach them about race. And so I think some of the things that Kimberly wonderfully laid out for us about the like proactive way about thinking about how are you exposing your child to race, right? When you think about the books that your children reads, like who's represented and what characters are they playing, and you know, are they three-dimensional characters? Is the Black person in the story just a sidekick, right? Do they have an actual, you know, are they helping move the plot forward, right? You can say that you're maybe bringing some of these things into your household, but how do we look more deeply into what does that intentionally look like? Maybe the artists that we listen to or the movies that we watch in those stories. I think the same wonderful things that Kimberly and Yasmin mentioned about that empowering image of Black folks, right? And knowing that our story is beyond our oppression and includes joy. How do we make sure that everyone is getting that same picture, right? That it's not just, your child's not just getting exposed to Black culture through slavery or through MLK or through Rosa Parks, right? What are the other ways you're engaging them in the wonderful Black scientists we've had, or the wonderful Black artists we've had, and engaging them in that way too? I think thinking like, I watched, and I don't know if I'm recommending this, but I watched this documentary a while ago. It was Mickey Mouse Monopoly, and it was talking about how does race and gender show up in movies, and in Disney movies specifically. And the thing is, these movies and these things are racialized already, right? And you know, folks want to say sometimes they think that we are, as adult, are putting these adult like racism or race onto these characters, when in reality they are racialized. And so how do we have those proactive conversations with our kids around, okay, let's break that down. That wasn't that was a stereotype. Let's talk about what a stereotype looks like, right? And I think engaging that, so that their first conversations, like we've kind of said, are not in the classroom when we're talking history. They've actually learned that race is part of our, though a social construct, part of our lived reality as we go through the world. So I love that idea of thinking about how to be proactive, how to be intentional, and creating that environment for our students to then be able to have those conversations and interactions with one another.
And that's so difficult. I love what you said about, you know, African Americans, Black people being seen as the heroine in the story, the person who, finds success, and teaching literature. That's one of the things that my kids have said over and over again every year. They're like, I don't want to learn stories. I don't want to hear stories about Black people always being the bad person or always being oppressed. And Taryn, I know that historically you probably, teach some of that in your classroom or feel some of that in your classroom. I mean, how do we change the dynamic?
So one thing that I was thinking about was, the fact that students do start to learn about slavery, specifically, as this thing that just happened. People came, there was slavery as this passive, magical appearance, and it also really disconnects from what was really happening. And Yasmin and I were talking about you can't really separate race and the formation of this country, right? And my approach in teaching history is that our American identity is socially constructed. And so there's not like, oh, today we're talking about slavery and then the rest of the founding fathers all separately for the next 5 weeks, right? It's like, how was slavery justified, and in what ways did Black people, right? Like, what ways did they find empowerment? In what ways were they in community with each other? In what ways were their own spaces actually places of happiness and freedom for themselves? And the students now, and a lot of the white students have actually mentioned, a couple years ago, I don't think, and this is, a paraphrase quote, but a couple years ago, I don't think I would have recognized my white privilege, but because of everything that's going on and all of the racial injustice that's, you know, surrounding me. I can't ignore it, right? They're saying that I know, like, I've been reading up on capitalism. I've been reading up on my white privilege, right? Like this generation is, and I have to give them a lot of credit. Like I'm in awe, inspired by like the ways that they engage with each other without me really having to do anything. And I don't think we give enough credit to young people to be able to understand. And then going back to the reality that, you know, we have to be proactive with our young Black kids, but then what happens on the other side is that I find that a lot of white families don't want to talk about race, maybe because they don't know how to bring it up, or, you know, at the end of the day, it's a dominant culture. So really you don't have to talk about it because it's not affecting you negatively on a regular basis where you recognize it, right? And this is not to go into like we're always oppressed. This is just to go into like the fact of racism itself. How do we grapple with this system if we're also not talking to our young kids of other races about it? And what that leads to is kind of that color blindness, right? Like, well, if you don't talk about race in your home, then like without that deliberate action and intentionality, then what happens is they don't see it as a problem. And then that continues until, you know, however long that continues. And it's harder the older you get to kind of like show people, you know, outside of the stereotype, when all they see is a stereotype, because they're getting those subliminal and explicit messages like that was mentioned. So it's a lot. I'm also taking notes because I have a 3-year-old. So I'm like, okay, yes. Okay, next year we'll have the, you know, but it's just, I teach US history. There's no, I just remember growing up, it was kind of like a paragraph on slavery as if it was this thing that was passively given to people that weren't people, really, the way that they were recognized in the history books. And so it is really important to make sure that we're not separating that and always recognizing race and class and intersectionality as a whole throughout the whole US history.
Mm-hmm. You bring up a good point, and you talk about you know, slavery and how things are right now and having those race conversations, but we're seeing so much of it in the news today. We talk about the injustice of people like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, which shook me to my core, but most recently, the story of Breonna Taylor. And Yasmin, I want to sort of address this to you. When we think about a female, an African-American female who was lying in her bed and was shot dead, basically. And you have an AG that comes out with a grand jury decision. And I'm like watching this, and I mean, I don't know all the particulars about the story, but you know, I'm watching this and I'm thinking, how could this have happened? And how could they render this decision on this particular case? How do we deal with that?
I would say the most impactful course I took in law school was called Exploring Alternatives to Neutral Principles. Mm-hmm. And there's a concept in law of neutrality of, you know, well, law is, you know, justice is blind. And there's these neutral principles. So if you apply these neutral principles, you'll have justice because there won't be shading in one direction or the other. You won't tip the scale one way or the other. And what I think in any context, if you're talking about impact of these constitutional law on disenfranchised groups in education or in housing or in employment, what you see is that, of course, nothing is it's all very subjective. People, you know, human beings are the people who are the ones who are enacting the laws, and so they bring their subjectivity to that. There isn't such a thing as neutrality. So in the context of criminal law, I think that what we're seeing is, you know, our country is historically over-policed, and we have a culture of over-policing. And so the roots of that are historical. and the justification for that plays out every day in the legal system. It is, you know, we have what's called qualified immunity for most police officers, meaning that you can't ever sue them civilly. You can't ever say, you know what, you overstepped. You did something that was not only illegal, but was disenfranchising people of their civil rights. So I'm going to sue you and you're going to be liable. That's not something, we have protection in our law for that category of civil servants and others as well, where you can't ever address that, right? And that's in one side. And just in terms of in criminal law, the way that the laws are shaped, they justify an extraordinary amount of violence from police officers. So you can't apply these neutral principles and not think that by doing so you're going to exacerbate inequity. So in this instance, you know, there was a grand jury, and what a grand jury does is a person gets arrested. There's two ways then, you just have an arrest, right? It's just a charge. To keep a case going through the system before you get to a trial, you have to have a formal finding of involvement. And there's two ways to do that. One way is through what's called a preliminary hearing, and that's where you have a hearing in front of a judge and it's a public hearing and anybody can watch. And the other way is through a grand jury system. And every system, every state system, and then the federal system, there's a certain amount of time that you have to try to get what's called an indictment through the grand jury. And if you don't do it by that time, you have to have a preliminary hearing, okay? So some jurisdictions choose to do most things by preliminary hearing. And if you do it by preliminary hearing, then everybody's there and everybody sees, and you see the witnesses, and it's a public hearing. If instead the grand jury system is used, that's all done in secret. And that is done with not just in secret where it's not a public hearing, but it's one-sided because it's the prosecutor talking to the jurors. The defense isn't there and the public isn't there. So you have this chamber where the prosecutor is talking to the grand jurors, and the question is, did this situation happen? More probably than not. So for most of the majority of critiquing that is of the grand jury system is, there's a joke where they say, well, you can indict a ham sandwich. You can indict anything. You can charge anything because it's all in secret. No, but there's no public scrutiny. And you're just saying, did this happen? More probably than not. So then that leads to the question, then why though is it so hard to indict police officers for what seem to be indictable crimes, right? Why does that seem to be so hard? Well, I think that there's a number of reasons. One, we don't know what's going on because the grand juries are secret. So there's not public scrutiny on the jurors or on the prosecutor. But also, the laws are written in such a way that the level of intention that someone must have to violate criminal law for if you're a police officer is very high, and it's very difficult to indict. So the combination of those two things lead us to where we are. So it's a long way. I mean, if I sound like, you know, I really now sound like a lawyer, and I'm trying not to, but it's a long way of saying that we have to, again, going back to, you know, Taryn, Jenn, and Kim's point, we have to look at all of these systems through a lens of history and understand that you have to look and see who's involved when you're saying, well, why is this consistent outcome happening in this particular way? I'm not saying that there's a failure to indict police officers who may be of color, who are violent, and when the victims of that are white. I'm not saying that doesn't happen either. It's not that cut and dry, but there are overall structures in our legal system and in the grand jury process which lead to a lack of consistency in outcomes.
I appreciate the way you broke that down for us. Well, particularly me. That makes a lot of sense. And so I then want to kind of expand on that question and ask you, so knowing what I know now from what you just told me about the difficulty of the indicting police officers and so forth and so on, what are my rights? I'm driving down the street, I get pulled over for no apparent reason because I feel like I'm doing the speed limit, 10 and 2, or is it 9 and 3? I can't remember what they changed it to. But I'm doing all the things right. What are my legal rights being pulled over? Should I get out of the car? Should I, what advice would you give folks in that sense?
Well, I'm gonna give you some practical advice.
Okay.
And I'm gonna tell a story. So I had a very dear friend when I lived in Washington, D.C., who was traveling with his aunt and his grandmother from D.C. to New York on, I think it's 95, Interstate 95. This was in the early 90s. And it was a route where if you were African-American, you were going to get pulled over. I mean, it was just, everybody knew, it was just something that happened all the time, particularly for men. And he got pulled over, and they pulled his grandmother out of the car, and they pulled his aunt out of the car. He listened, followed their, instructions. They then left them on the side of the road while they did, I think it was a 45-minute search of all of the items in the car, all of their, everything through their suitcases, everything that they had, they were traveling for, I think it was for Thanksgiving. And then realized there was no, that they didn't fit the description that they were relying upon, that they didn't fit the profile. And then it's what we call a pretextual stop, but they didn't admit that, they just let them be. He complied. He did not argue. He did not consent to a search. They went and did it without his consent. They said, "Can we search?" And he says, "I am not consenting to a search." But they used other, what they claimed, reasonable basis to conduct the search. He then took a big deep breath and he documented it, and he did it immediately. And the ACLU became involved, and it was one of the most seminal cases of a lawsuit against those officers for pretextual stop and a violation of his civil rights. So the moral of that story is, if you're pulled over and you are asked for your registration and you are asked for your license, then you comply with those requests. If someone asks you to search the car, will you consent? Will you agree? No. You do not consent. There's no reason for anyone to violate your rights. It's not a violation, but there's no reason for you to consent. And then you do so politely, you do so calmly. Okay? And if you are asked to comply with any other requests, you can politely decline, because you're in a very vulnerable position. For example, if there's a request for a sobriety test, you could be in a very vulnerable position of a subjective analysis of, well, you were tripping, or you were swerving when you that's if it's really important, then they can ask you to come down and they can take a blood alcohol test or something like that. So I guess there's the practical advice of you have to be calm, keep your hands visible. You have to produce, your license and your registration. You may ask, "May I ask why you're pulling me over?" And then after it's all over, if someone goes too far, then you have a real, network at Marlborough of civil rights lawyers and others who will step in to see if your rights were violated and unfairly, and if you were the victim of a pretextual stop. we can talk separately about what does that mean that we all have that talk with our children and with ourselves. But that wasn't what you asked me.
Thank you.
I feel like I want to react to just overshare that after seeming like one tough cookie, I'm on the verge of tears just hearing that described, right? Like, I mean, because when you asked me to be a part of this conversation, BK, there was, to some extent, you articulated that this is just horribly difficult to, I said, the constitutional law professor in me is constantly worried about tyranny and just having a free democracy. And that you were asking me to hone in on another set of very deep emotions. And I am just a bit of a hair away from just emotional collapse at the prospect of me or someone I love. And I've been in the position of it being a very innocent, I mean, just seeing police officers is innately traumatic. And when we moved to LA for the first time, which was many years ago, seeing an LAPD police car sent a chill through my husband and I, seeing the campus police. And that was before we saw, and I can't even bring myself to watch these horrible murders on. I mean, I know I have psychic limits, and I feel like, again, I'm all this talk at the beginning of the call, and now I'm like, oh no. But if it comes to actually watching someone murdered in a video, I don't know that I can handle that, and I have to protect myself from it. So Yasmin, I appreciate that lesson, and at the same time, I'm also just thinking of all the emotions that would be running through me. And I think that's why this is good for you to say, and I'd be a little bit afraid, I just want to confirm, you shouldn't be afraid to say, I do not consent.
Right.
Like, that's what I'm hearing also, the lawyer plus, like, imagine putting myself in there. That's the best thing to do, because, is it because it's best legally? Because again, I've seen too many movies, will they put something in my car? It makes sense to me that it's better for me to say I don't consent, because if they find something later, I didn't consent to it. Well, but I'm also just afraid.
Well, it's a choice though. I mean, it's a question. You don't have to consent. And if you don't feel like consenting, you don't have to, but there's a practical reality of course that's scary. And then that could mean that, you could have, there's a thought, I think often that, well, if I just consent, I know I don't have anything, so then it'll be fine and it'll be over and we can get out of here. There's that as well, and there's not a right or wrong answer per se. I was just speaking from and answering the question of what are your rights. But I think it's really important when we're, having these conversations and we're looking at these structures that we all have to find a way forward. We have existing structures. There's a lot of conversations around the country about reform, and there's a lot of movements within departments themselves of wanting reform and wanting difference and reimagining public safety. That the more that we can all be a part of the conversation in a collaborative way, as a community together, with all of those stakeholders together, meaning, law enforcement and activists and policy experts and everybody together moving forward, as a, from different perspectives coming to what is most rational and makes sense for a community, that I think that, that's a different analysis than like, what are your rights if you get stopped? That's a different analysis of how terrifying it is as a parent. That's an analysis of like, well, what are we going to do? And when I think of these students at this fabulous school and what opportunities there are just for the future, I'm equally heartened as you are, Taryn, when you talked about like, you have a generation of people who have insight that is extraordinary from a social perspective and historical perspective of a self-analysis of white privilege without shame. So they can say, okay, yep, I have white privilege. I didn't ask for it. Here I am. So now what are we going to do about it? You know, to talking about, you know, history of policing and what makes sense and how did we get here from just an objective perspective. You know, what do we want? What's necessary? Who's the best first responders? What makes the most sense? You know, I mean, I just feel like we're in a really, I mean, you know, a really unique time in history. We're watching history unfold, and the leaders are the children. And that's not new in social movements, and certainly not new in civil rights struggle in this country, but it is something that is very inspiring, I think, right now with this generation in particular, and especially.
You know, and just thinking about time as well. Kim, you said something earlier when you talked about having a race conversation, and how sometimes when you have the race conversation, people think that you're a racist because you always want to have the race conversation. Am I paraphrasing correctly? And one of the final thoughts that I want to ask everyone is that, how do we heal from that? You know, as a community, Mixed Wells, I mean, we're trying to come together as a community, and there are going to be slip-ups. People are going to say things that they don't mean. And we are sometimes quick to react, but how do we heal? We learned this summer about, you know, having these difficult conversations, not only in the classroom, but in our personal lives and with students around, and how to stifle some of those things that kids are saying as they move about our campus. But how do we heal from these race conversations when we've been victimized, or maybe when we've been wronged in a situation?
I will share, you know, one of the important things that we talked about as we kind of engaged in that work that you talked about, BK, was basically this concept of intention versus impact, and this idea of community, right? I think, like, when I think about myself every day on the street and an interaction with a person, if they harm me around a racial conversation, I'm not investing a lot in coming back to that person and rebuilding with them, right? That's not where my energy needs to be. But when I think about our school community like Marlborough, where we are coworkers with each other, where we have classmates, or we're in teams together, I think about the fact that we have to keep, or because we are in school, we come back to this community over and over again. And so how do we keep coming back to these conversations, knowing that harm has occurred and harm is likely to occur again? And part of that has been thinking about, how do we as members of this community take up the task of thinking about both the intention of those folks who maybe harmed us, but then those folks who cause harm actually thinking about impact. And I think a lot of times we've gotten a lot of space to think about our intention, right? Oh, I didn't mean that, or I didn't know better, or you know, you're taking it too seriously. But oftentimes we don't sit with, oh, that actually reinforces a stereotype, or that actually made someone feel like they don't belong at our school, or that actually made someone, you know, I kind of made them feel like a second-class citizen in our school. And I think when we hold space for both, it allows us to re-enter that community, right? So like, if I know that everyone who causes harm is going to think about the impact and try and do better, that might mean that I can maybe hold space also for their intention, that they didn't mean to do it, because they're willing to accept accountability for the harm that they happen. And then that cycle continues as we grow from, like, okay, I'm gonna take for a benefit of doubt that you didn't mean to harm me, but can you hear that you harmed me? Mm-hmm. And I think starting from there allows us to hear each other better, right? If I can hear that impact, maybe I can reflect on, how do I make sure that impact doesn't happen again? If I didn't intentionally mean to harm, but I still did, what do I need to change about what I did in order to not recreate that harm?
Great.
I'm tempted to connect that to the broader American society and the historical reality of so many Black lives lost
Mhm.
before the ones that drew broader non-Black attention this summer. And on the way to what I was going to say, I want to say that also hurts. I mean, if I just get a little soapbox, that stings. Because this did not just start this summer. I mean, and that makes me sound kind of cranky, but yeah, if we're going to put it all on the table, that's also something that people should take accountability for. That if we've been marching and resisting, and Yasmin's been working, and all this stuff has been going on for centuries. Okay, I'm done. But then this intent versus impact, it relates to the moment about structural and systemic racism. So that's the core of the big national debate. The current president of the United States and his vice president will not acknowledge systemic racism in a country that has been enriched by very purposeful oppression and subjugation on the basis of race that is specifically, as Yasmin said, a focus on subjugating Black people, people of African descent. And so that through line from just the empirical reality of who we are as a nation and a moment of unique national reckoning that I'm very grateful for. It is wonderful that we're not in the America where young people believe the things that young people believed when Yasmin and I were in law school. So I don't feel that now. I teach constitutional law, I have students, they do not deem me, I'm kind of in now. It's like, oh, I'm the constitutional law professor who knows to talk about race, how to talk about race. It's like, it's like, oh, we're doing anti-racist now? That's a term I can use? I know exactly where to put that in my lecture properly. So it's also a moment, and I think Yasmin was getting at that it's very unique in the sense of you've got a whole generation of young people who are actually focused on the centuries-old problem, learning a language, and hopefully willing to take, and this is, Jenn, I think where I was trying to connect at the school level or the personal level, but to the national level, recognizing and accepting that there is systemic, meaning there's systems. And that's what I heard Yasmin describing. When she gave us that wonderful lesson that I still, I don't remember who I learned criminal law from back in law school. I was really trying to think, who was that? I was like, I remember who taught me constitutional law, but that was a great refresher. But the whole point was you described a system. And you said the system by itself doesn't have intentional in the sense of there's race consciousness built in specifically in the policies on the page. But empirically, as a matter of how the world works, it has outcomes that unjustifiably, disparately oppress and subjugate and murder and kill and end in terrible outcomes for Black people over and over again. And we can't be an American community if people in our community don't want to accept that impact, as you said, Yasmin said, without shame. Right? Like, I'm not asking, you to self-flagellate over it, right? I'm not saying you're personally responsible, but we can't be community if you don't recognize the reality of our community. But it is really very unique to have what is going on simultaneously with so many other things for me to see that other people are using terms and concepts that I didn't know I would even live to see it. So so that's a very positive place that I'm in as far as the impact intent dichotomy.
Thank you. Taryn, Yasmin, you have any comments? Good. Wow.
Beautiful note to leave on. I don't even want to.
No, it really was. But I didn't want to leave you both out. I was like, gosh, you really did a great job summing that up.
You guys are
well,
great.
I definitely want to thank you all for this wonderful conversation today. I think we learned a lot. I learned a lot. I don't know about everyone else, but I hope those who have the opportunity to listen to this conversation will appreciate the wealth of knowledge that was displayed here today. So thank you all for that.
Thank you all so much. It's wonderful.
Thanks, Yasmin. You're the best.